Well, we're not going on with major Bible events this morning. We're going to go on with what I started last Sunday, which was exhortation. And now I'm calling that exhortation part 1. We're going over exhortation part 2 today. Exhortation means to encourage, to challenge, and that's what this is all about. It's encouraging us and challenge us to be all that God expects of us. And what He expects of us is doable, because He is the great enabler. He enables us. Anything that He commands, anything that He expects, He provides the power and the resources, everything we need to do it. I'm going to start this morning. It may seem a little out of the ordinary, but I'm going to begin with the preface, part of the preface. No, I think it's the prologue to Joseph Dillo's book, Final Destiny. That book is about 600 pages long, and I would recommend it to anyone. So all I know to do now is jump into it. But I caution you, buckle up. Throw on the afterburners, because we're going deep this morning. And it will touch every one of us as it should. A universal tragedy had occurred. The morning star, known as Lucifer, God's perfect one, full of wisdom and beauty, the angelic being whom God had appointed as ruler over the ancient cosmos, had fallen. He concluded that God's gifts were more important than the giver, that dependence on God and obedience to His revealed will were not necessary. He became the Satan, God's adversary. He was cast to the earth, and the earth was judged. At that time, the earth from which he ruled and on which he lived became without form and void. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. We shall give this rebellion a thorough trial. We shall permit it to run full course. The universe shall see what a creature, even the greatest, can do apart from God. We shall set up an experiment and permit the universe of creatures to watch it during this brief interlude between eternity past and eternity future called time. The spirit of independence shall be allowed to expand to the utmost, and wrack and ruin which shall result will demonstrate to the universe and forever that there is no life, no joy, no peace apart from a complete dependence upon the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And I throw in one little line. Most believers have not learned this. Now I continue. The Lord Himself could have destroyed this rebel immediately. He could have answered this challenge with raw power. But He had a better plan that would forever answer this satanic alternative. A plan that would involve Himself personally in a moral demonstration of His love and grace. He would one day demonstrate the superiority of ways, that being dependence and servanthood. I want to go back to this one line again, because I think this is what this is teaching us, what it's all about again. And the rack and ruin which shall result will demonstrate to the universe and forever that there is no life, no joy, no peace apart from complete dependence upon the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. That's the thrust of what I just read. Now, another way of saying dependence and servanthood, which are the superior ways that this noted, is trust and obey. Again, another way of saying that we are to have the superiority of ways, meaning have dependence and servanthood. Another way of saying it is trust and obey, which is the song we just sang. It has a line in it. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. No truer words have ever been uttered. God gave Lucifer, whose name was changed to Satan, adversary, after he fell, as well as all angels, he gave them all free will, which is freedom to choose. He gave it to us as well. But Satan mistakenly decided that freedom meant that he could do anything he wanted to do without experiencing consequences. In other words, he thought that freedom and authority are mutually exclusive. But that is most certainly not true. Authority without freedom is tyranny. Freedom without authority is anarchy. So we begin to see that freedom is linked to authority. Freedom does not mean that we can do anything we want to do without consequences. Now, it is true that we can do anything we want to do. Now, I'm being sensible here. I will never be able to jump up and dunk a basketball in the round. My legs are too short. I can't get the height. It's not talking about that we can do anything whatsoever, but it's talking about whatever we want to do, God has given us the choice to do it or not do it. So again, authority without freedom is tyranny. Freedom without authority is anarchy. Anarchy is chaos. So we have the freedom to trust and obey God or to act independently from Him and disobey Him. And then there's that word but. But He holds us accountable for our decisions. Satan didn't want to be held accountable. He thought that he was so great and wonderful, which he was, perfect in every way, the greatest creature that ever came from the hand of God. But he got arrogant. And he thought, well, I have this freedom. I'll do whatever I want to do. Why should I have to submit or answer to God? There are two absolute spheres of power that operate in the universe. One is God's sphere of power, which can be called the divine sphere of power or the divine dynasphere. You've never probably heard this word dynasphere before unless you went to Baraka Church and heard R.B. Thiem Jr., who was my mentor. Let me put it this way. He was my sub-mentor. My mentor and your mentor is the Holy Spirit. But he is the one that expressed it. God used him as a vessel to reach me, get me out of serious biblical error, and start on the road to spiritual maturityhood. And it's a long road. So let me go over that again. I want to be very deliberate, and I want you to be concentrating very carefully, because these are deep and very important things that I am teaching this morning. There are two absolute spheres of power that operate in the universe. One is God's sphere of power, which can be called the divine sphere of power, or the divine dynasphere. R.B. Thiem Jr. coined that word, dynasphere. You won't find it in the dictionary. It comes from two words. The Greek word dunamis, which we're going into Thursday night, which is translated into English as dynamite. What do you think about when you think about dynamite? You think about power, don't you? So you have the divine dynasphere. You have dunamis, and then you have sphera, which is sphere in the English, and it means the sphere of power. The other is Satan's sphere of power, which can be called the cosmic sphere of power or the cosmic dynasphere. Satan's got a sphere of power as well. Cosmic comes from cosmos, which means the world or worldly. Okay, so what? We have two spheres of power. What does that mean? What I'm about to tell you, I want you to really concentrate on this. We can choose to operate under the divine domain. When you are operating in the divine sphere of power or the divine dynasphere, then you are in the divine domain. That's the domain of God. So we can choose to operate under the divine domain by submitting to God, or we can choose to operate under the cosmic domain by submitting to Satan. What we cannot do is be independent, which a lot of people think they can. Now, we can act independently, and we do act independently, at least in our minds we do. For instance, in the Garden of Eden, Eve decided that she was going to act independently of God and her husband. And she got that idea from Satan, who had indwelt or become some kind of form of a serpent. And look what it cost her. So she acted independently because she was deceived. Adam acted independently knowing what he was doing. But the cost was astronomical. So we can choose to operate under the divine domain by submitting to God, or we can choose to operate under the cosmic domain by submitting to Satan. What we cannot do is be independent. We either operate under God's sphere of power or Satan's sphere of power. When we act independently from God, we submit to Satan, and when we act independently from Satan, we submit to God. Do you get it? So people who think, well, God forbids me to do certain things, but I like to do those certain things. And sometimes we choose to do those certain things that He has commanded us not to do. And sometimes we don't do the things that He commands us to do. We have the free will to do that. We can make that choice. But what we cannot do is what Satan thought we could do, is do them without consequences. God holds us responsible for the decisions that we make. That is the nature of things. There are so many people. Now let's start limiting this not to just people, but just believers. There are so many believers that think, well, you know, I don't want to be gung-ho either way. I don't want to be gung-ho about being a Bible thumper. I don't want to go off the deep end in religion or the Bible. But then again, I don't want to be a scoundrel. I don't want to be a lowlife. I'm just going to kind of play the middle road. I'll be all right. That's independent thinking. There is no middle road. You've heard me say before. In our spiritual transmission, there's only forward, drive, and reverse. There is no neutral. And that's what so many Christians do. They think, well, I'm so busy, I got so many things to do, I'm going to really get more serious about going to church and studying the Bibles. I'm going to do that, but I just have too much on my plate right now. How many believers would be described by that definition? Lots. So we are either submitting to God by obeying Him, or we're submitting to Satan by being influenced and submitting to him as well. By the way, what we were describing to begin with Satan's fall is called the angelic conflict. It started with him, and instead of just using raw power to vaporize him, which God could easily have done, he decided that he would create another creature, lesser than the angels, but they would have one thing, very important thing in common: free will, volition to choose. And so we have that choice. When you think about God's omnipotence and omniscience, it's so vast you can't hardly contain it. Well, we can't contain it. We just get a little idea of it. But just think if God had created us all as robots. In other words, He programmed each of us that we would act a certain way. Think how much easier it would have been on Him. He wouldn't have all the rebellion. He wouldn't have the angelic conflict. There also would be no grace. There would be no love. There'd be so many things that we cherish that we wouldn't have. So I'm telling you that your ability to choose, free will is a two-edged sword. It was designed to be that way. And we as believers have to be ever mindful of that, because we make decisions every day. You made the decision to come here this morning. There are those out there that made a different decision. And there are consequences for those decisions. And they will never know what they could have had, because you don't know what you don't know. The Bible describes two classifications of believers. Hebrews chapter 5 classifies one as being dull of hearing. Now there's two classifications, but I'm not saying, because I'm going to Hebrews 5 here, that dull of hearing is one of them and then there's another type. There are two classifications, and this one classification has several terms that describe it. I just happened to go to Hebrews chapter 5 to describe where the Bible describes one classification of believers is dull of hearing. I'd like for you to turn in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 5. And we're going to start with verse 11. But verse 11 is predicated on verse 10. And the writer of Hebrews in verse 10 brought up the Melchizedekian priesthood. And he probably saw what most pastors see when they bring up such a term, and that is, huh? Not only could he not teach it to them because they didn't know what it meant, but he realized that those he was teaching were dull of hearing. That means they weren't really interested in going into the Melchizedekian priesthood. Why would they want to know about that? What did that have to do with what was going on in their life? Why should they waste time with something that they were not interested in? That is what dull of hearing is. So I'll put some of this up on the board for right now for those who don't have a Bible, and I suggest you bring one or we'll furnish you one. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 11. Concerning him, the him here is Melchizedek, the one that he mentioned in verse 10. He says, concerning him, Melchizedek, we have much to say, and it is hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing. Excuse me. Now, the phrase become dull of hearing means that they weren't always dull of hearing. They became dull of hearing. They weren't born that way physically, and they weren't born that way when they were born again. In other words, there was a time when they were not dull of hearing, they were very much interested. I have one little thing there on the board. I don't know if you can see it, but I've got to point it out. The phrase become, and I have a little deal here. It's a verb. It's a perfect active indicative. Now, the perfect tense is very important because it's something that happens in the past, but what happens in the past, the results of what happens in the past, go on and on and on. The imperfect tense is something that happens in the past that goes on and on in the past. But the perfect tense is something that goes on in the past and the results go on and on. So becoming dull of hearing means that the consequence of being dull of hearing goes on and on. Excuse me. The active voice, of course, talks about the believers were the ones who were dull of hearing. Indicative mood means it's reality. It wasn't a potential. It actually was occurring. So the Greek word for dull is nothros, N-O-T-H-R-U-S, which means slowness of perception due to moral laxness or irresponsibility. Really what it boils down to, they weren't interested. They did not care. Dull of hearing. I took a sociological class at Texas A&M, and I barely sneaked by with a D because I was very dull of hearing. And it didn't help that the professor was monotone. In classical Greek, it was used as an epithet for the mule who stubbornly refused to obey. They would just say, nothros. We say that in the English anyway. That's translated into the English. Okay, now let's look at verses 12 through 14 because they're instructive as well. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. Notice this all developed. It came to pass. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. Of course, these are symbolic. Milk would be the very primary basics of something, and not solid food would be those, there's more substance in it. Verse 13, for everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. That's another category of believers. I mean, it's in the same category of, I'm just going to call this, excuse me, well, it evades me. Let me see if I can think of the term. It'll come to me. They're known as babes. Verse 14. But solid food is for the mature believer. I just remembered the name. The name I was thinking about, that dull of hearing and babe, and we'll look at other ones, describe mediocre believers. So the two categories of believers, I ascribe to one as being mediocre believers and the other mature believers. Verse 14, but solid food is for the mature who, because of practice, have their senses trained to discern good and evil. Look at the word practice there. Practice, present active in doing, indicative. That means they keep on practicing what they have learned. I guess I'll keep these notes up for a little bit. Now, that's one classification that believers fall into. The other classification refers to mature believers, which includes those who are accustomed to the word of righteousness. And the word of righteousness, I have BD there, both capitals, because I think they ought to be capitalized, refers to Bible doctrine. They are accustomed to the word, to Bible doctrine, to learning it and applying it. So the other classification refers to mature believers, which includes those who are accustomed to the word, word of righteousness, Bible doctrine, and because of practice have trained, because of practice, let me add a little something right here. I did this morning. And because of practice have been trained to discern good and evil. I got up early this morning, an hour earlier than I normally do, because I was awake and I was thinking about these things. And I thought, I need to remember these things, so when I wake up, I can get downstairs and put them on paper. I said, that's not going to happen. I knew I would forget it, so I got up and went down there, and this is one of the things I was working on this morning. So we have mediocre believers, we have mature believers, and every believer, through their decisions, will categorize them as one or the other. Do y'all want me to keep these notes going up here? All right, if I catch anybody reading ahead, it's not going to be good. The difference between the two types of believers has to do with perseverance and persistence. Does that ring a bell from last Sunday? Perseverance. Life has times that are severe. And when those times come, we are to persevere. But we don't do it through our own power, do we? Mediocre believers become dull of hearing because they lack persistence in learning the word, whereas mature believers keep growing spiritually by their commitment to be biblically trained and then practice what they learn. That is a conscious decision. It's not a one-time decision.